Hello, how are you?
Hello, how are you?
Really good. Want to introduce yourself and then we could get started on Civil War? And also, like,
Sure.
so much. This is awesome. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure. My pleasure. This is a nice break in the day for me to talk to some smart young people. So I'm Professor Jeremi Suri. I'm a professor at the University of Texas at Austin, and I have a great job. I get to work with wonderful students. I get to write books, do research, give lectures, all kinds of fun stuff like that. I'm from New York City originally. I went to Stuyvesant High School, public high school in New York City, and then went off to college and became a professor. Maybe some of you will do the same thing. And I've written books on the history of the presidency. I've written books on Henry Kissinger and American foreign policy, social movements, and the most recent book I wrote was on the legacies of the Civil War for our society today. So I'm really eager to talk about this topic or whatever you guys want to talk about.
Do you want to get started with the Civil War, maybe or how about even just covering your book? Would that work?
Sure,
Okay.
sure. So I'm sure you all have seen a copy of it. I hope you all have seen. But it's a great gift for people. So my book is about the legacies of the Civil War for our world today. It's not about the Civil War per se, but what happens after the Civil War. And I'm sure you've covered this in your classes to some extent. But the book looks at the 20 years after the Civil War and the unfinished business that we see still in our politics today. So actually, the book begins with January 6th and then goes back to 1865, and then from 1865 to the 1880s, and then back up to the present. There's sort of three arguments I make in the book that I think might be interesting for you as historians, as history nuts like me, and as people who follow politics. And I think they'll be familiar, but maybe not as familiar as they would be normally. I think our textbooks are catching up to our research still. So the first argument is that many of the losers of the Civil War, many Southern Confederates, don't actually give up, that they continue to fight long after. And there's a lost cause myth that carries on, which basically says it was legitimate to resist Union power. It's legitimate to protect white supremacy. It's legitimate to protect certain groups, and that a full multiracial society is not possible or not desirable. And that has many different forms, but it's the equivalent of if there were former Nazis today saying the Nazi regime was not so bad. Right, it's those from a discredited losing regime that continue to carry on a story about there being legitimate, valiant, heroic. So that's one element, and that has many forms. It justifies a lot of local violence. Groups like the Ku Klux Klan, the Red Shirts, today the Proud Boys are a manifestation of that. So that's one argument, that there's a continued resistance to union and to multiracialism and to integration that comes out of the Civil War and continues. The second argument is that many of those who resist Union power end up becoming very powerful themselves. That one of the problems after the Civil War is that the criminals are not convicted, are allowed to return to power. Andrew Johnson pardons many of the Confederate leaders. It would be as if we pardoned Vladimir Putin and all the Russians who invaded Ukraine and allowed them to come back into power. And so there's a way in which the war is over, but the regime doesn't change. And there's a justification for continued violence and for some of the behavior that the war was supposed to be over. And then the third point is that in spite of these two difficulties, there still is a lot of change. And so I talk in the book about many white Republicans and many African American Republicans and others who push for enormous change in our society. And that change occurs at the same time that there is this resistance. So that's the movement towards civil rights that begins with the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and the constitutional amendments that I'm sure you've studied, the 13th, 14th, and 15th. So part of the point is that the country is going after the Civil War in two directions at once. Despite our textbooks that make us think, you're in one era or another era, in fact, the old era bleeds into the new. And so American society after the Civil War becomes more multiracial and more democratic, but also more repressive and more white supremacist. And both are happening at the same time. And that's the analog for today. That's where I close the book. I talk about some things we can do today to use this history First of all, we need to teach this history, but ways we could use this history to understand our own current moment. And what's happening in our society today is, I think if you look around, right, we're becoming a more diverse society, a more inclusive society, and we're becoming more exclusive and separated at the same time because there's a resistance to that change as there was after the Civil War. Today in the United States, there are more foreign born US citizens, more US citizens who were born outside of the US than there has been since the 19th century. And for some people like myself, the child of immigrants, just like for those after the Civil War who were part of the changes, this is a really positive thing. But for those who feel that their power is being challenged, this is a really dangerous thing. And I think this comes back, this will be my last point I'll make for now, to a truism in American history, which is that history is not driven, our history is not really driven by race or by any ideology, though ideologies matter. It's driven by power. And those who have power don't like to give up power, and those who don't have power want power. That was the whole point of the American Revolution, to then create a system that would allow more people to have power. And the challenge we face today, as after the Civil War, is how do you deal with new groups after the Civil War, 4 million former slaves, today, large numbers of immigrants and others, who by existence, by coming into schools, by coming into businesses, are challenging the established power of others.
I'll start with this. You had said something about teaching history. You mentioned lost cause myth, and kind of you didn't mention it, but we're polarized in the history narratives that we tell. We live in a pretty red area. We're in Pennsylvania. You drive down the road, you're going to see like Confederate flags, and they would say, heritage, not hate, or something. They have totally different ideas. When you said you're writing a book, like how we should be teaching history and some of these solutions, what are ways that we can kind of build bridges, especially as like educators,
Yeah.
And in the history that we teach and the ways we teach it, that we can come together, learn history for what it is as best as possible, to try to
Terrific
produce
question.
the best citizens.
Terrific question. I was just at a conference last week. I gave the keynote at this conference in Salt Lake City with 400 history educators, National Council on History Education. I don't know if you're familiar with it. And this was exactly the topic. And we spent a whole day talking about it. So what you're asking is like the $1 million question, right? So I think certainly the way to teach history is not to wag your finger at people and tell them that they're wrong and bad and things like that. That just turns everyone off. That's not the way to do it. But it's also not the right way to teach history as a kind of feel-good celebration of one group or another. History is not going to a sporting event and cheering, yay, USA. That's fine to do that. It's okay to be patriotic. But our patriotism, which matters in the classroom, should not guide our analysis and research. So I think the way to teach history is to teach history as a full story, the good and the bad, the achievements and the failures. It's sort of the way I think about parenting. We have 2 teenagers. Actually, our second is just going to be going to college soon. And, I've always thought the best parents were not the parents who told their kids, you're always right, you're always the best. Now come home, eat chocolate cake, and watch TV all night. The best parents are those who say, we love you, we care about you, we support you, but we're going to hold you to high standards. And if you do something wrong, if you don't do your homework on time, there are going to be consequences at home, right? Same thing here. We should teach that our country was born of very high aspirations, probably higher aspirations than any other society. And in part, we've lived up to some of those aspirations. Look at free speech in our society. No society has free speech like our society. I'm the child of immigrants. I get to be a professor. I can't imagine that, in any other society. My mother's family came fleeing pogroms in Russia. She's Jewish. My father's family came fleeing starvation in India. I'm half Indian, half Jewish. That's like, right? That's an American story, right? That's the beauty of our country. All of us. I'm guessing there's no one in your room who's on the Mayflower, right? We're all mixes. That's the beauty of our country. But then we also have to acknowledge that we haven't always lived up to our aspirations. And we believe in our aspirations. It's patriotic to say, I love my country. I want my country to live up to its aspirations. And where it hasn't, I'm going to hold it to account. Slavery would be one of those. The white supremacy after the Civil War and the violence of the Ku Klux Klan and things like that, which I talk about. I talk about it in the book Memphis, 1866. If you don't know this story, you should. This is a prosperous African American community of former slaves. They've been in the Union Army. There were 125,000 slaves who ran from their plantations to join the Union Army. They put on a uniform. They defended the Union. They were building a town, a community in Memphis, and the white community didn't want them there, and not only violently attacked them, raped the women in public, burnt their houses down, did all sorts of. It's all documented. There's no doubt any of this happened. We have to hold ourselves to account and say that's unacceptable. And the people who committed that crime, which included the local police sheriff in Memphis, local judge, they were part of the rioting band of white people that went and did this to this free Black community of veterans. None of them were convicted. None of them were convicted. That's not acceptable. That's not living up to our ideals. And I don't think there's anything unpatriotic in saying what I just said. We're a country of law. We're a country of fairness, and we need to hold ourselves up to the highest ideals. That's how I teach the very period we're talking about here. Abraham Lincoln was fighting for the highest of ideals, and so many Union soldiers, so many people living in the Confederacy too. And we should give them credit for that. They were fighting for their independence as they saw it. But that does not in any way, acknowledging that, justify our being silent or whitewashing the crimes that are committed as well. So I'm for a full teaching. I want young people to see our country in its highest aspirations and its greatest achievements and where it's failed, and be motivated to make it better. And I think if you frame it that way, I hope that reasonable people can see that what you're doing is not intended to make anyone feel attacked, nor to celebrate anyone. It's to help us build a better country. That's what I think we're all about.
Would you be able to talk about the party switch?
Yeah.
Okay, because I actually had one person in this room talk to me about it before. Is it real? Is it not? And talk to me about the details.
Yeah.
Go ahead. I'll pass the mic.
So it's a great question. So the switch from how the Republican and Democratic parties flip, right? That's what you're asking about, yeah?
Yep.
Cool. So absolutely. So I have a whole chapter on the Republican Party in the book. The Republican Party, again, here's how you can, by the way, disarm people who think you're some sort of, I don't know, arch critic of the U.S. if you say critical things. The heroes in this book are the Republicans. The Republican Party was founded in the 1850s, and the first Republican president, everyone in the room knows, right, was Abraham Lincoln. And the Republican Party for Abraham Lincoln was the party of ordinary people. The Democratic Party was the party of slave owners in the South, and plantation owners and big business owners in New York and others. The Whig Party was the party of economic development, also the party of big business and the railroads and things of that sort. Abraham Lincoln was a poor white man born in Kentucky, lived most of his life in Illinois. He had no slaves. He had very little land. Slavery was an abomination to him, not just for moral reasons, but for economic reasons, right? If someone could get a slave to do something, why would they pay him? Why would they pay you a good wage if they get someone else to do it for free? So Lincoln was part of this new party, a pioneering party that was designed to give ordinary men more say in politics. The Republican Party was about free labor. Everyone should be able to work and get paid for their work. Free soil, everyone who works for a wage. The party was built around small shopkeepers, small
Sorry,
land.
could you rewind like 10 seconds? Or like Wi-Fi like paused it.
So
I'm sorry.
Where did you get? Did you have? I talked about where Lincoln.
If you're working for a wage to get free.
Yeah, right. Good. Thank you. It helps me remember what I was saying. So that if you worked for a wage, every person should be able to work for a wage. So someone, poor man like Lincoln, should be able to get a job, work for a wage. They should be able to buy land, and then they should be able to participate in the politics of their community. Free labor, free soil, free men. Free labor, free soil, free men. That's what the Republican Party was all about. And the Republican Party not only stands up for union, it's opposing the spread of slavery. Lincoln is not necessarily opposed to the continued existence of slavery, but he doesn't want slavery in the new territories west of Illinois, because if it's been those territories, there'll be no opportunity for ordinary men like him. So heroically, he stands up against the forces that are trying to spread slavery and prevent opportunity for ordinary men. The Republican Party is the party of ordinary men who want opportunity. And then it becomes the party after the Civil War also of former slaves. So most people don't know this. Jackie Robinson, everyone knows who Jackie Robinson was, right? Raise your hand in the room if you know who Jackie Robinson was. Yeah. First African-American in the major leagues, right? Played for the Brooklyn Dodgers. Jackie Robinson in the 1950s, when he came into baseball for the Brooklyn Dodgers, he was a Republican. He was a Republican. African Americans were Republicans until the 1950s, because the party of Lincoln was the party of opportunity, and opportunity for white men, opportunity for black men, opportunity for brown men, yellow, etc. It was also the party that supported suffrage more than the Democratic Party. So this was the party of ordinary people of opportunity. The Democratic Party was the party of the Confederacy. I make that point in the book. It was the party of the former slave holders. And that was true in a state like Texas until the 1940s and 50s. The switch happens in the 1950s and 60s, because what happens 100 years after the Civil War is the Democratic Party slowly moves, first with Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal, then with John F. Kennedy, and then a lot with Lyndon Johnson. The Democratic Party moves to accept civil rights, and it becomes the party of civil rights reform. Why? Because the Democratic Party wants those votes. As the population of African Americans and immigrants and others grows in places like Texas, those are votes the Democrats like Lyndon Johnson want. So the Democratic Party moves to accept civil rights. The Republican Party moves in the other direction, because the Republican Party then moves toward those who fear that with all of these new voters and all of these new interests dominating our politics, it's going to close off opportunity for white men. And so the Republican Party is the party of opportunity. That is the party of civil rights, until civil rights includes a much wider swath of people. The consistency in the Republican Party has been the desire to provide opportunity for those who are seen as individuals striving, often white male individuals. The party moves away from civil rights when it sees civil rights not serving that constituency. And it also moves away from civil rights because the Democrats have taken that issue and won so big. Lyndon Johnson in 1964 wins the biggest victory of any president since Franklin Roosevelt. He wins like 62% of the vote. And so Republicans like Ronald Reagan then begin to articulate an alternative position, right? Which is the position that civil rights have gone too far, that now government has gone too far, right? Ronald Reagan was originally a Democrat early in his life, and he moves to the Republican Party, just as some Republicans moved to the Democratic Party. So the issue of civil rights makes the Republican Party what it is initially, and then it motivates the Republican Party to switch in the 50s and 60s. Does that answer the question? Do you want more on that? Or does that answer the question?
I got thumbs up.
Is there a movie about that baseball player, Chadwick Boseman?
Yes, there is. There are two movies about Jackie Robinson. One of them is 42, because that was his number, and the other one is, I think, called The Jackie Robinson Story. They're both really good. But what's interesting is, again, people assume he was a Democrat because he would have been a Democrat in the 1970s, but he was a Republican in the 1950s.
I don't see how the party switched. Like, it's more like the Democrats just caught up and the Republicans never changed. Like, things like affirmative action are making it about race again. And that point of civil rights going too far is valid. So I don't think it's switching.
So that's a fair point. You know, there are some who would argue what you just said. And affirmative action is a complex issue, right? So I don't think affirmative action is indicative necessarily, and I think you've got a good point. I think the issue is more that the Republican Party since the 1960s has relied much more on, if you look at the voting numbers, right, has relied on almost exclusively or largely white male and female votes. And that's certainly true if you look at Trump and if you look at George W. Bush. The only change has been in recent years, the Republican Party has done a little better with Hispanic voters, but still, it's done better than it did before. It's still a far smaller number. So if you go to a community, if you go to a rural community in Pennsylvania where you are, I can predict how someone voted in that community pretty well by whether they're rural and if they're white or not white. And that's just how the party has changed. That's not what would have been true. Those voters would have been Democrats that I'm referring to now. They would have been Democrats in the early 20th century. So the candidates are, of course, we can argue over which candidate, and Donald Trump is not really representative of the Republican Party. I would agree with you. There are a lot of Republican moderates who are very pro-civil rights, maybe as many as there are Democrats. But the voting base, who votes for which party, has definitely swung. You know, when Ronald Reagan was running for president, and Ronald Reagan was a racial moderate, Ronald Reagan was a supporter of civil rights, and Ronald Reagan signed an immigration bill. Right, the last major bill allowing more immigration was signed actually by Ronald Reagan. So Reagan was a racial moderate, but when he ran for office, he made a point of going to Mississippi and making the case that he was about states' rights. He said that in the same community where the three civil rights marchers in 1964, civil rights activists, Cheney, Schwerner, and Goodman, had been killed. No other candidate had gone there since then. He went and actually kind of reached out to that community and in a sense legitimized the racial violence. That's not Reagan, that's campaigning for office to get elected, but that tells you about how the party had moved. And my point is actually those voters were like that. They were Democrats, now they moved to the Republican Party. So you could say it's the voters who pushed the parties in different directions, and the voters might not change. But that does change the parties who they vote for.
So my next question is, and maybe an impossible one, where do you see the political parties going now?
I don't see how the Republican Party can continue on the direction it's been under, at least the Trump part of the party, and ever win an election again, because the country is becoming more diverse and more educated, whether we like it or not. And so I think the Republican Party, one of the reasons I wrote this book is I want the Republican Party to come back to some of what I think were its great roots. I think it should be a party that's about opportunity for all people. I think the Republican Party should make the case and legitimately try to make the case that what they're doing will help diverse populations do better. It will help young, educated populations. Instead of reaching out to the non-college educated, resistant population to change, they should do the opposite. They have a lot to offer. And that's what I'd like to see the party. They're going to have to if they want to win national elections. The problem is they can win local elections this way because of gerrymandering. You can get someone like a Marjorie Taylor Greene in Georgia, just as you can get extremes on the other side because of gerrymandering. But if you want to win elections, you've got to appeal to the middle. The person who said that most clearly was Ronald Reagan. That's what Reagan was trying to do. And I think if Reagan were alive today, that's where he would try to move the party. Reagan would not be for saying horrible things about immigrants. He would not be for saying we should abandon Ukraine. He would not be against funding public education. He would not attack teachers. None of those things Reagan did. He would say we have to bring the party back to the middle, to its Abraham Lincoln roots.
How about the Democratic Party?
Well, so I think the Democratic Party, the Democratic Party now is a more diverse coalition of different groups. I think the Democratic Party is it's got a group that's going to the far left. It's got a group around Biden that's toward the middle. And I think it's got to come up with a common theme and keep itself united rather than going in so many different directions at one time. But it is interesting, right? The Democratic Party has become more the party of markets than the Republican Party, right? Look at how Republicans attack, companies like Disney and others, and Democrats support them. So the Democrats have a lot of work to do to figure out what their identity is. I think the problem the Democrats have is that they're about everything and nothing at the same time, which could be even as bad. That could be worse than being extreme. And so the Democrats need an identity, and the Republicans need to move their identity into a place where it can actually resonate with the majority of Americans.
I don't know if you cover this in the book, but we are from Pennsylvania. So I did want to ask, I've seen you on Lex Friedman talking about Lincoln, Grant, and so on. Can you talk to us a little bit about James Buchanan, since he's
Yeah.
a Pennsylvania president? So
Yeah, of course. And Buchanan is in the book. In fact, most people don't know about Buchanan. I'm glad you brought that up. That's awesome. James Buchanan um, was, he really was trying to prevent a civil war from occurring, right? He was kind of caught in the middle. And I think that Buchanan's most important contribution was to try to keep the different parties talking to one another and prevent things. He was trying to find compromise. But I think what Buchanan didn't realize was at some level, in order to create compromise, you have to do something more than just propose the status quo. You've got to move to something else. I think his challenge as president was that. Buchanan was very sympathetic to Southern slaveholders, but also was not an arch supporter of slave expansion. And so he finds himself kind of caught in the middle. And I think the lesson for all of us is the way to pursue compromise is not just to be stuck in the middle, it's to actually come up with ideas that will move things forward rather than just staying in the status quo. The way I think about James Buchanan is he was just trying to sort of hold things in place as long as he could. And I think that's a losing strategy. But he was a good man. He was a good man.
What is I ask all of our guests this, favorite part of history?
Oh, my favorite.
Were you asked this on Lex Friedman's podcast?
I don't remember. I don't think so. No, I think we were talking more sort of specifics. So my favorite period to study is in some ways still the Cold War, which I wrote a lot of books on, because it's a period where foreign policy and domestic policy come together. Things like the Vietnam War, the Korean War, the legacies of World War II, the Holocaust, of course. I find that fascinating and so relevant. What's the favorite part of doing history? I really like what I'm sure your students get to do a little bit. I really like when you get to read the original materials and then read how different people have interpreted them and come up with your own interpretation. How do you make sense of the world as you see it? How do you recreate? Like for this book, I spent a lot of time reading old newspapers, which was so much fun for the period after the Civil War, trying to recreate why so many people thought John Wilkes Booth did the right thing. The book opens up with people actually defending John Wilkes Booth. And why did so many people think he did the right thing in some parts of the country, like Texas and elsewhere? So that part is fun, reconstructing another world, which is sort of what people do in AI also, right? You reconstruct another world for us to experience it and learn from it. And I love the writing and the storytelling.
Can you expand on the John Wilkes Booth support?
Yeah, so this is where the book opens. Many Americans, not half the country, but maybe close to half the country, thought Booth did the right thing. And this is, I get this from newspapers all across Texas, Georgia, South Carolina, etc. And they thought Booth did the right thing for two reasons. One, they feared that Lincoln was going to impose a harsh peace. And there were all kinds of rumors that Lincoln was going to take away people's homes, force white people into slavery. And so these rumors had people really frightened about Lincoln. And there was a sense that many had that he was a tyrant. He was seen as a tyrant. That's what he's called in the South. So Booth was a hero because he slayed the tyrant. And secondly, there was anger. Even those who didn't believe that were angry at Lincoln if they lost. And so it's sort of like when you're angry and someone does something to someone you're angry at, it makes you feel good, right? There's Schadenfreude in that. It's a fancy German word for my joy in the pain of others. And Booth was doing, it's the same thing that Trump does that some people like, where when Trump insults someone who you don't like, it feels good. And that's what Booth was doing. He was attacking someone that many Southerners didn't like because he was, of course, the commander-in-chief of the Union forces. And so there was a kind of emotional reaction to it. In the North, there was an emotional outpouring because of the love of Lincoln. In the South, there was an emotional outpouring for Booth because of the hatred of Lincoln. We have to be careful in life not to support people who simply do bad things to the people we hate. That doesn't make the world better, right? Because you're out on the football field and someone tackled you and then someone goes and clotheslines them or undercuts them the next time. That doesn't actually improve your chances of winning the game. It actually makes it worse, even though it feels good at the time.
When you're doing the research and going through the newspapers, what are some of the resources like that you use, even just for your book, that are accessible to history students like that I have?
Great. So I want to recommend, that was the one thing I was thinking about before we came on. I want to recommend 3 places your group can go to look for great sources that are free and easy. One, the Library of Congress has a newspaper database. Just Google Library of Congress newspaper database. It is so awesome. I'm going to nerd out on here for a second here, right? You can basically go in, put in any city, any time period, and get old newspapers from that period. They don't have every day, but if you put in your part of Pennsylvania and you put in a set of years, let's say you want to look at the years your grandfather came to this area or whatever, you can find newspapers. It's super interesting and fun, and you can just read them on your laptop. I used to have to go into the microfilm when I was in graduate school. I had to go to the basement of the library and microfilm. That's why I have glasses, because I was reading microfilm for so long. You can do this on your laptop. Library of Congress newspaper database. Second resource I love using are presidential libraries. Every president from Hoover on has a presidential library, and then they've gone back and created some. There's one for Garfield, there's one for Lincoln, and just go presidential. Let's say you want to look at Eisenhower Presidential Library. They have all kinds of documents available. For example, if you're interested in the Cuban Missile Crisis, you can go to the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library, and they have a whole section of documents just on the Cuban Missile Crisis. So presidential libraries. Third source that I think is absolutely incredible and super useful is a series called Foreign Relations of the United States. Foreign Relations of the United States. Again, just Google that. Those are State Department documents. They go back to the Revolution. And the State Department publishes documents in yearly increments that show what American diplomats and others are doing. So if you're interested in World War I, you can read online almost all the documents, or many of the documents, for U.S. policymaking during World War I. So those are 3 sources my students in college use all the time. If you start using those in high school, you are well prepared for college. Again, Library of Congress newspaper database, presidential libraries, and Foreign Relations of the United States.
Excellent. Thank you. So we have about 5 minutes left. I have one more question. You have one? Oh, two questions. Now they're coming with 5 minutes left. Go ahead.
It's very open-ended. When I was in college, we talked about the Nadir of Race Relations, and I never was able to fully wrap my head around it. I know we're looking at post-Civil War time period here. I was never able to fully grasp it. I was wondering if you had anything to offer on it.
I didn't hear. What was it? The nature of race relations, you said?
Nadir of Race Relations.
The nadir of race relations, the low point of race relations. Right. And so, and that being the Civil War, that's what you were referring to?
Yes.
Yeah, I think you could argue it was the low point of race relations, the Civil War. I think it's a fair point, because it was a period when, the only period when we went to war to defend or to fight over race. We've had low scale violence ever since, but the goal of democracy that we've usually succeeded at is, even though there's been tension and violence, we have not made our politics about one race versus another. Whereas in the Civil War, even though the majority of the soldiers fighting on both sides are white, the war it's not over states' rights, the war is over slavery. And so we've allowed racial issues to put us at war with one another, and we can't ever let that happen again, obviously. So that's why I'd say it's the nadir, but it's not the only low point. We come up from there, but the question is, do we come up as high as we should come? My belief is, and I don't think race is the most important issue, but I do believe there's a lot of work we have to do as a society to still overcome the legacies of racism in our society. The average African-American family today has a net worth that's about 1/10 the average white family, and there are more black men in prison than there are in college. And that's not good for anyone. That's not good for anyone, but it's still not it's not as low as we were in the Civil War. And by the way, I don't think that's anyone's fault in this room It's actually because of historical patterns. That's the whole point. We can fix this without having to blame anyone. And there's another question, yeah.
Do you think that, like you, in your argument, like the third argument, you stated that there's like a power struggle. Like, do you think there will always be a power struggle in some way, shape, or form? I feel like a very like current example would be like, in terms of like nuclear weapons, like whoever has the most is like considered to be the most powerful. And then like looking back at it at like world wars, like America, Britain, and like Soviet Union are considered to be like who have the most power. Like, do you think it'll always be something?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. Yes, I do think power relations always matter. I think they matter more than race. I think people who have power never like to give up power. It doesn't matter who you are. And I think power always has its privileges. So people always want power. And so that's the reality. Now, a functioning political system that we've had better than most other societies, but still could make it better, is a system where people can share power. And people who have power don't feel they're losing power by others getting power. And that's the challenge both internationally and at home. I don't think we'll ever be at a point where there aren't power struggles. But the question is, how do you manage power struggles? How do you manage it so those who have power feel comfortable and those who don't have power have access to power? That's why I believe in education. I think education is the best way we do this, public education. I'm a product of public schools. You guys are public school, right?
Yep.
I'm a product of public schools in New York City. My parents are immigrants. They had no money. I couldn't go to some fancy New York school. I went to public schools. I got a scholarship to college, and I got to do what I do and live better than anyone in my family ever did before. Even though we're not rich, we get to live well because I had an opportunity, right? Education gives you a chance to get power because when you're educated, you have access to knowledge and you can use that to get a job and do things you wouldn't do otherwise. But hopefully the people who are really powerful already see that as helping them because it makes our economy stronger, right? It makes everyone better off. That's why I'm for education. And I'm always skeptical of those who are not for education. Because I think if they're not for education, they're really afraid to see new people challenge them, aren't they? But what people should recognize is that even the most powerful people benefit from a more educated citizenry that can have access to more power that can help our economy grow. And so that's really my position, why I've always been an educator.
So we have about 30 seconds. Your advice to history students.
My advice to history students is find the kind of history you love. It doesn't matter. Military history, social history, ancient, modern, read a lot of it, write about it, and that will help you get into college. And when you're in college, that will help you no matter what you decide to major in. If you know how to read well, and you know how to write well, you will succeed in anything.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Good to meet you all.